Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. I wanted to start a new series on the channel, so you guys will have to let me know if you like this idea, if you want to see more of it. But I wanted to do some editing demonstration, so just to sort of take a scene from an aspiring writer's novel and talk about how we might change it and what the editing process would be like, and to sort of walk through my reasoning for the different changes I would make and why. I really thought this would be a good way to sort of tie together all the different things that we've talked about on this channel, especially recently. We've talked a lot about paragraphs, descriptions, sentences, and I thought this would be a great way to sort of tie everything together and to see sort of practically how you actually go about implementing these concepts when you go to line edit your scenes. So we're mostly going to be talking about line editing. I'm not at all going to get into proofreading, so I'm not going to be dealing with punctuation, grammar, spelling, things like that. And I'm going to touch a little bit on scene structure just because really anytime we line edit, scene structure and line editing can be kind of intertwined a little bit, so it's difficult to not talk about both. So we're going to touch a little bit on some minor scene structural elements, but mostly we're going to be talking about line editing. I do want to mention, of course, that editing is subjective, so there's not one correct way to edit something, and that means that you might not agree with all of my suggestions. You might have a different idea for how you would edit a particular sentence or a paragraph, or you might like the original version better than my edited version, and that's completely normal. So as an editor, I will try always to appeal to the widest variety of readers or the largest number of readers, so that obviously so that the book can have a wide appeal, so that it can sell well and reach a wide audience. But of course, we're all different in what we like, and not everybody is going to like the same thing. So though I will do my best always with editing to make it have broad appeal, there's always going to be things where you might like the original better, or you might have a different idea for editing. So I am going to try to walk through my reasoning so that you guys really understand why I'm making the suggestions that I'm making, but it's completely okay if you don't agree. And of course, constructive criticism is welcome in the comments. Just please be polite to the writer, our wonderful volunteer for today. It takes a lot of courage to put your writing out there, and I don't want to discourage other people from doing that, and I don't want anything overly hostile or mean in the comments, so please just try to keep comments constructive. But with that said, a huge thank you to our volunteer for today, Cabrielle Holden. She is a supporter of mine on Patreon, and she was kind enough to let us look at her second chapter today for this video. So we're going to be looking at her second chapter for her YA fantasy novel, Fairy Tears. And it's just really nice of her to let us look at this, and I really appreciate it. And so please express your gratitude to her in the comments. And if you want to go a step farther and support her, you can follow her on Instagram at Cabrielle Holden, or you can visit her website, cabrielleholden.com. And again, if you want to leave her constructive criticism in the comments, I'm sure she would be very grateful for that. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this series, that you get a lot out of it, that it helps you to sort of pull together all the different concepts we've talked about on this channel. And so with that said, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 2 of Cabrielle Holden's novel, Fairy Tears. Victoria got up before the sun. It was the only way to ensure she was up before her father. She had already filled her satchel with everything she'd need the night before, so all she had to do was dress and go. She walked slowly from her room, trying not to creak the floor as she went. She slowly pushed open the door to her father's room at the end of the hall. So a couple minor points for this paragraph. All she had to do was dress and go doesn't mean that she actually did get dressed and go. And since the next sentence is she walks slowly from her room, it could be read as if she walks from her room still needing to get dressed. As a bonus, if you do describe her getting dressed, you can clarify what she's wearing to add a stronger visual element. For example, she pulled a dress over her head, or maybe she tucked her pajama shirt into a pair of trousers, etc. The last two sentences repeat slowly and also feel a little wordy. She walked slowly from her room, trying not to creak the floor as she went. She slowly pushed open the door to her father's room at the end of the hall. This last sentence feels particularly wordy. I would probably change this to the door to her father's room or her father's door at the end of the hall, because the door to her father's room at the end of the hall is a lot of words for a fairly insignificant detail. In the dim light of the smoldering fire, she could see his form under the comforter. She released a breath. He was still asleep. She had half expected him to be up already, tinkering away in his lab with his latest invention, or sitting at his desk putting notes in his journal. He snored loudly and snuffled, rolling over, and Victoria quickly pulled the door shut. She felt a tinge of guilt as she walked down the stairs. It sat like a heavy weight on her chest. Maybe she should leave a note. It wouldn't be ideal for the guest of honor to be missing the morning of her birthday. She went to the sitting room and lit a candle. Victoria pulled a piece of loose paper from her leather satchel and wrote a quick note. To increase tension as well as clarity, I would recommend adding a sense of why she doesn't want her father to wake up. What will happen if he does wake up? Will he be disappointed in her? Will he punish her? Will she lose some kind of right or some kind of privilege? Victoria probably has a logical reason behind her actions here that tie this all together, but as a reader, I want to see that reasoning spelled out a little bit more clearly. Just help me engage with what she's experiencing. Father, found the most amazing discovery yesterday. I'm in the woods to catalog a new kind of insect. I am taking Novi. Won't be long. Love, Victoria. She placed the note on the coffee table where it wouldn't be missed and blew out the candle. Her body felt a little lighter, but she pulled her necklace from her dress and put it in her mouth anyway. The metallic tang and the click of metal against her teeth were a comfort. Victoria pulled a shawl from the table next to the front door and tied it around her shoulders before walking into the dark, cold morning. So there's nothing particularly problematic or bad about this opening scene. However, I don't find my interest peaked quite as much as I would want. And I think that's mainly because the stakes just aren't really clear. So she doesn't seem to want her father to know that she's sneaking out. But having read the rest of this chapter, I didn't get the impression she was afraid of her father or that there were any particular consequences. I didn't even really get the impression that if he woke up, he would necessarily stop her from going out. Because of that, I'm struggling with why she's so worried. So what exactly is at stake? So you could emphasize a variety of different stakes. It could be external or internal. So you could add stakes such as her father punishing her. So maybe she thinks that if she gets caught, she's going to get a specific punishment, and that's going to be unfortunate for her for whatever reason. It could be she'll lose some rights or privileges. It could also be more internally focused. So maybe she debates about whether she wants to violate her father's trust in this way. Maybe, they've always had a really open relationship and she doesn't want to disappoint him by sneaking out. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways you could potentially add conflict to the scene, and you could create stronger stakes. You would know better than me because this is your character and your story, and I have a very limited picture of what the story is about and who this character is. I'm just thinking right now that this opening scene doesn't have quite as much stakes as I would want to really get that excitement and enthusiasm going for what she's doing. An alternative option would be to simply mention that Victoria left the note in the next scene. We don't really need to see it happen, since in the next scene she's outside actually heading off and looking for the bug. You could cut this scene and simply explain the vital details in the following scene. For example, I might grab a couple sentences from the first paragraph, change it slightly, and use it as the start of the next scene. Victoria was outside before the sun was up. She had packed her satchel with everything she'd needed the night before, so all she'd had to do that morning was get dressed, leave a note for her father, and go. Then you can just move forward with her actually going to look for the insect. But again, you know your story best, and so you'll have to determine if it's better to add stronger stakes to this opening or to simply cut it. It's possible that because this scene is sort of obligatory, so you mentioned the scene has to be included in the novel, it's possible that because of that, you don't really have very good stakes, so maybe you just don't really have an idea of what's actually at stake. You just know that these events have to occur. In that case, you might need to add stakes by sort of integrating it into the broader plot line or into her characterization in general. It's not super uncommon to have this problem in a scene where the scene's necessary, but maybe just not as tied into the conflict, especially because the main conflict of the novel hasn't started yet. So you almost need a pre-start of the plot conflict, internal or external conflict, just to keep things interesting until that main plot sort of gets rolling. And that's kind of what I think might be going on here. It could also be the case that I'm just missing, like I'm just personally not seeing the stakes, even though maybe it would be clear, or maybe you mentioned the stakes in the first chapter, and because I didn't read the first chapter, I'm a little bit in the dark. In either case, I would be clear about the stakes. Even if you do mention the stakes in the previous chapter, I would still mention here what exactly she has to lose or what she is putting at risk by sneaking out. Let's move on to the next scene. Tacking the horse in the almost pitch black of the morning was difficult, and Victoria almost changed her mind several times. She could always go later, after the party when the sun was still up, but how exciting would it be to share her findings with everyone at the party? Most of the town would be here today. Her father would be so proud. A rush of excitement made her wobble on her feet. So right now, this motive is feeling a little young for YA. I'm thinking this feels more like a 10 to 14-year-old, and I believe that your character is quite a bit older than that. Mainly, it's just because her motive feels a little too pure and simple. And usually as we get older, we acquire more baggage and we might be a little more vague or oblique about our motives, even to ourselves, even in our internal dialogue. We're less likely to just directly think, I want this for X reason. So I would try to make her introspection a little bit more mature by maybe making it less direct or making it a little more complicated. So maybe taking it to another degree of depth. So not just wanting to impress people, but a deeper, more meaningful reason that she wants to impress people. I think this would help to just mature it up a little bit so that she feels older, because right now I'm not really getting an older teen vibe from this introspection. Victoria walked Novi out of his paddock and locked the gate. She gave him a handful of oats from her bag and then mounted him. She looked out over the property. It was as quiet as the dead in the early morning hours. Even the birds were quiet. The sun was just starting to rise behind the house, which was perfect timing. It hadn't occurred to Victoria that the woods would be dark and hard to navigate so early in the morning. They would stay on the path and not go farther than her father allowed, but even that deep in the woods, everything would be black before dawn. This paragraph feels just a little hodgepodgey to me. There are lots of disconnected descriptions, making it hard to really grab hold of a single clear point. So what we want to do is pull out some main points, a purpose behind the paragraph, so we can make the descriptions feel a bit more intentional. I think you're trying to imply that she's scared, but to be honest, I didn't interpret any of the descriptions as scary. I thought the darkness in the woods was being mentioned more because it's inconvenient, especially with the emphasis on it being hard to navigate, and because a paragraph back she mentioned how hard it was to tack up the horse in the dark. However, I found that also to be a confusing interpretation because she also says the timing is perfect. I'm not sure in what sense the timing is perfect if the woods are dark, so that could be clarified. I think wires are probably just getting a little crossed when it comes to your meaning here. If my interpretation is correct and Victoria is meant to be scared, I would definitely recommend editing this paragraph with Victoria's fear being the glue that ties the descriptions together. That way we can tighten everything up and make it more logical. As the writer, you might already read this and just see that fear gluing everything together, but for me as the reader, it's just not really there yet. So to create a better sense of her fear and to create a better sense of organization with the paragraph, I would probably change Victoria walked Novi out of his paddock and locked the gate to something like Victoria eyed the dark woods as she walked Novi out of his paddock and locked the gate. This gets us primed to see the dark woods as something Victoria is nervous about. Then I'd probably jump to the sun was just starting to rise behind the house, which was perfect timing. But I would change it to flow more logically from the previous sentence by again emphasizing the darkness, by writing something like, even though the sun was starting to rise behind the house, not a single ray broke through the canopy of the woods. I really liked the next line. It hadn't occurred to Victoria that the woods would be dark and hard to navigate so early in the morning, but I would cut out hard to navigate because I think it emphasizes inconvenience more than fear. So I'm cutting this down, and also I think we can create a better connection to the previous line about the sun starting to rise by adding still. So in the end, you'd have the sentence, it hadn't occurred to Victoria that the woods would still be this dark. So now that we've established the general vibe, let's go back to earlier in the paragraph. I really like the line, it was as quiet as the dead in the early morning hours, but I would cut it down to just it was as quiet as the dead because ending on dead emphasizes that scarier word a little bit more. And we also already know that it's early morning, so it just saves us a little bit of extra words. Now, if we put even the birds were quiet, we will end up with two instances of quiet very close together. So let's switch that just a little bit to something like even the birds weren't making a sound. So we don't have a ton of this paragraph left, but obviously she has to mount the horse for logic's sake, so we want to keep that sentence. She gave him a handful of oats from her bag and then mounted him. Let's again try to wrap the sentence into the concept a little better with something like, she took a deep, calming breath as she gave Novi a handful of oats from her bag and then mounted him. Now, I also really like the sentence, they would stay on the path and not go farther than her father allowed, because to me it creates that sense that she's sort of mentally justifying continuing, sort of like she's talking herself into it. However, I think we can add a little more punch to it and flesh out the sort of mental journey she's going on in this paragraph by writing something like, it would be okay, they would stay on the path, they would not go farther than her father allowed. I made this choppier than the original to give a stronger sense of anxiety, but you don't have to do this if you think it's too dramatic for what you intended. I would probably also knock off the second part of the sentence, but even that deep in the woods, everything would be black before dawn. Just because with the changes, we basically explained that already earlier in the paragraph, and cutting it out makes the emotions feel punchier. So now what we have left of the original paragraph is she looked out over the property. I wouldn't bother working this in because it's not really necessary. So now we have a paragraph that retains almost all of the original, but has a much clearer glue holding everything together to guide the reader's interpretation a little better. Victoria walked the horse slowly to the forest, giving the sun time to catch up to them. The cool autumn wind whipped her skirt and her hair around as Novi walked along. They reached the path as the sun peeked over the curve of the earth and lit the world in orange and gold and pink. The birds began to chirp and the wind rustled the trees. The sound of Novi's hooves on the hard-packed dirt and the birds twittering in the leaves made Victoria relax a tiny bit. She reached her hand to the necklace and walked Novi into the woods. Prior to mentioning that Victoria relaxes a little bit, the descriptions in this paragraph feel pretty choppy and lacking in tone or clear meaning. Like with the previous paragraph, there just isn't that clear glue to tie the sentences together. She walks the horse, the wind whips her skirt, they reach the path, the world is lit in orange, the birds chirp. There's a this happened, then this happened, then this happened feeling to the writing. There just isn't an overall sense of cohesion. Since late in the paragraph Victoria does relax, then perhaps the point of the descriptions is to demonstrate why she relaxes. If this is what you'd like to go for with the paragraph, then I would crisp up the concept by starting with her still feeling creeped out and then describe the birds chirping and wind rustling and then describe how that calms her down or show how it calms her down. This will create an easier to follow progression. However, I lean a little bit towards not taking that route with this paragraph because though you kind of dissipate tension here, you then go right back into her being at least somewhat scared in the beginning of the next paragraph. She wasn't scared, not exactly. She'd been on this path hundreds of times, but someone always knew where she was. So to make these two paragraphs more logical, I would either cut this first paragraph down to the essential details while maintaining the concept that she's scared, in other words, not shifting her emotional state at all, or I would reverse the order of the emotions here so that she's scared in the first paragraph and then find some relief that then prompts her to actually move forward with her plan of going into the woods. In that way, you would be creating a conflict, being scared, a solution, the calming sensations of the woods and the sounds, and a conclusion, going into the woods. This will be a lot clearer and tidier. Let's read the rest of this next paragraph. Maybe she should wait until her father woke up. She didn't have to ask him to come with her, but she'd feel a little better if someone knew she was in the woods. Victoria straightened her back and furrowed her brows, keeping her eyes locked on the path ahead. This might be her last chance to make a discovery and impress her father, and wouldn't it be more impressive if she did it fully on her own? So you definitely have the right idea in creating some internal conflict. She wants to impress people, but this requires that she go into the scary woods, which she doesn't want to do. And that's exactly right. That's perfect for scene structure. However, I'm finding the motive a little bit unclear, or it might be that it's slightly weak. It could be either way. It could be that you're not bringing it across very clearly, or it could be that it just isn't strong enough. So whether this is present in the book already and I'm just missing it, or maybe it's in the first chapter, which I didn't read, I would recommend adding what she stands to gain from from impressing people. So if she succeeds in catching this bug and it impresses people, then what? What's she going to get from that? What is she looking to actually achieve? Does she want additional respect? Does she want I don't know, some kind of prize, making new friends, impressing a boy. There's a million possible reasons she could want to do this, but I just think you need to include some introspection to give the reader a better sense for why she wants this specifically. Victoria nodded her head and gripped the reins tighter. She walked Novi at a steady pace and searched the woods for those blue lights. After a few minutes, she turned to see how far away the house was. It was still perfectly visible, not obscured by trees at all. The sun was almost over the horizon, and the color had shifted to bright orange. This paragraph is again just a bit lacking in cohesion. The sentences don't lead into each other or work together to create an obvious point. Let's run through each sentence real quick. Victoria nodded her head and gripped the reins tighter. Gripping tighter feels like she's nervous. She walked Novi at a steady pace and searched the woods for those blue lights. This feels like she's sort of hitting her stride, or maybe she's sufficiently distracted to not be super nervous anymore. After a few minutes, she turned to see how far away the house was. It was still perfectly visible, not obscured by trees at all. This could imply she's comfortable because she can see the house, or the fact that she's checking at all could imply that she's nervous, so without additional details, the reader's interpretation could go either way. The sun was almost over the horizon and the color had shifted to bright orange. This feels like maybe she isn't scared because the woods are totally bright now, so it gives sort of a happier vibe overall. Like with the other paragraphs, I would make the emotion clearer, whether it's shifting or staying the same. Is she getting less afraid? Is she equally as afraid as she was before? If she's equally as afraid as before, you might consider how these descriptions are potentially going against that and giving the opposite impression, because things are brighter and the house is still visible, so that gives sort of a lighter, less nervous vibe. It could just be clarified here exactly where Victoria's at in her sort of emotional journey. I hope you're not bored, Novi, Victoria said, mostly to disrupt the silence. So personally, I might be a little overly cautious about this, but I feel that when boredom is mentioned in a novel, it prompts the reader to think about being bored, and I don't think that that's generally a good idea. Now, you could shift this to something like, Novi sniffed a leaf as if bored. At least one of them wasn't terrified. And that could work because it would maintain the emotional through line. Aside from the birds and the wind, it was very quiet. The quiet made the trees around her feel bigger, as though they were leaning down to suffocate her. I really like the effect this description has of maintaining her sense of fear. However, if someone were going to be nitpicky, earlier she found the sound of the birds and wind relaxing. Presumably, there's no change to the degree of silence surrounding that. So if anything, it's maybe a little bit louder now that she's in the woods, which would be maybe even more comforting. So this might just seem a hair contradictory depending on the reader. You could probably go either way with it, but if you were going to be overly cautious, some readers might feel like this is slightly inconsistent. She shook her head. I'm being so ridiculous, Novi, being afraid of this place. Novi snorted. I've just never been here without anyone knowing, but I can still see the house. Ridiculous. So talking to the horse might be sort of a quirky thing that Victoria does, and that's completely fine. But right now, I'm not really getting the sense that this is a mature personality quirk. It more comes across like she's a little kid. And because she's supposed to be a teenager, you might want to play around with either surrounding that dialogue with more mature introspection, so we get the sense that she's older, that she has more complex thoughts and feelings about the situation. Or you might even want to cut the dialogue entirely if it's not a significant personality quirk. If you're including it because you felt like dialogue was necessary, you just didn't want really dense narration, so you thought the dialogue would help to break it up, I don't think in that case I'd retain this dialogue. Maybe she could make a few comments here and there to the horse, but I don't think her expressing her introspection in the dialogue instead of using introspection is really going to be that successful, just because it's going to make her seem very, very young. On the other hand, if you want to play this off as a personality quirk, I think that could totally work. I would just also pair it with a little bit more mature, complex introspection. A bush rustled nearby on the path, and Victoria froze, pulling Novi to a stop. A tiny bunny ran from the underbrush across the path and ducked into another bush. Victoria let out a breath. Stop it. You really are being ridiculous. Victoria nudged Novi into a walk and rolled her shoulders back in an effort to relax. She pulled her necklace and put the pendant in her mouth. She sighed. She felt like a child. So this is a little tricky. The last three sentences feel repetitive in structure because they all start with she. However, I find the repetition of Victoria in the majority of the paragraph equally distracting. She's the only one in this scene other than the horse, so I would switch Victoria to she in the vast majority of cases across the whole scene. But I'd also probably pick one sentence from the last three sentences to reword to avoid starting three sentences in a row with she. The sun was fully risen now, and her father was probably awake by now. There's repetition of now, but that's an easy fix. That made her brighten a little. He would discover her note soon, and then she'd no longer feel alone in the woods. He might join her, or he would let her do her research alone. Either way, the thought made her feel so much better. At this point, I'm kind of wondering why she went out alone if she wishes her father had joined her. So I'm not sure why she didn't just ask her father to go with her. Did she think that he would say no? Was there some reason that getting it on her own? I know she mentioned that it'd be more impressive if she did it on her own, but again, taking this a step further, why would it be more impressive if she went on her own, and what would she gain by being more impressive? It's just almost giving me a vibe that her sneaking out in the morning really doesn't have anything to do with anything, because she seems to prefer, or it seems that she would have preferred if her father came with her or if her father joined her now. And maybe she's kind of backtracking psychologically, so she thought that she wouldn't be scared, or she thought she'd be able to do it on her own, and now she's regretting it. But I think you could walk the reader through that thought process a little bit more clearly. You could potentially edit this so that she imagines her father will join her, so sort of as a way to comfort herself, or you could simply cut it because it's sort of raising questions about her motive that are a little bit confusing. The motive itself might also just need refining. She nudged Novi into a quicker walk, urging him deeper into the woods. She could still see the house, although the path had turned slightly, so the house was blocked by some trees. She wasn't too far, though, no farther than she'd been before. I'd like just a little bit of a clearer point added to this paragraph. The house is still a little visible, so is the conclusion that she's not too scared, or that she's still scared despite being able to see the house? Again, I just want a little bit more guidance to follow her reasoning, her mental state, her emotional state, etc. They walked in silence for several more minutes, and Victoria wondered if she would be able to see the lights on the path. I would change this to the more definitive, there still weren't any lights on the path, because it keeps the focus more on what's going on in the moment. Maybe they never came this way. She looked around to see if there was a way Novi could take her off the path. They wouldn't go far from the path, certainly not far enough to lose sight of it. 2 clauses in a row ending in path feels a little clunky, so I'd change one of those. I think you could clarify her reasoning for why the lights might never appear on the path. Did she previously see the lights off the path and so thinks maybe they never go on the path? She could even purely speculate. For example, she could think that maybe the insects avoid the path to stay away from people, and that's why she never saw them previously. I just give a little bit more of her thought process to pull the reader into her headspace. Victoria pulled the reins and led Novi into the woods through the underbrush. The bushes and saplings pulled at her skirt, and she had to duck to keep from hitting her head on low branches. Soon they were deep enough in that it was easier to walk. She could still see the house through the trees, though it was practically blocked out by the dense trees. 2 clauses in a row ending in trees is just a little bit awkward, so I'd reword that. Without introspection or a sense of emotional progression, it feels a little repetitive to keep mentioning exactly how visible the house is. Try to give the reader a better sense of why it matters to keep describing each individual instance. So what's different between the different times that the house is brought up? What's changing about Victoria's perspective, her emotions, etc.? She pinched her lips into a flat line and pulled at her necklace. She had just started to turn Novi around when she saw a twinkle of blue in the corner of her eye. Why was she about to turn Novi around? Do you mean she was going to bail on the plan? I think if that's the case, I'd flesh that out and emphasize it a bit more. If she's just giving up on her plan, then that would be fairly significant to her, so you would expect a little more introspection. If that's not what you mean, you might want to cut that or reword it because it's just a little bit unclear. Did you see that, Novi? Victoria pulled Novi about to face deeper into the forest, and a mass of blue twinkles ebbed through the woods. Victoria turned in the saddle to see if anyone was out and about yet preparing for her birthday party. She could see no one. She could barely see the house. So to me, a lot of attention is being pulled away from the blue lights when that should really be a sort of all-consuming goal for Victoria at this point. I think a little bit too much emphasis has been put on the horse, and I'm not sure why she suddenly wants to look to see if people are preparing her birthday party. It pulls a lot of focus when she's faced with her goal, the blue lights. So I would expect that to sort of be all consuming at this moment. So I would cut the sentences about her looking for people unless you can add information to clarify why she's concerned about it in this moment. And I would probably cut her turning the horse to or move it to when she actually nudges the horse forward. The blue lights turned and went deeper into the woods in a glowing mass. Victoria reached into her satchel and pulled a small jar out. It was for food preservation, but would serve her purpose as well. I think it can be inferred that it serves the purpose well, so I would probably just change small jar to preserves jar or jelly jar and just save yourself a few words. She only needed to catch one insect long enough to study and draw it. Catch long enough implies it's going to escape, or maybe you mean that it's going to suffocate so she can't keep it for very long, or maybe she needs to hide it from people so she can't keep it for very long. It's just not entirely clear what this means, so I would try to clarify that. The lights twinkled and blinked as they flowed through the air, back and forth through the trees ahead of them. I feel like they're calling to us, Novi. She leaned forward to whisper to the horse. Father says every curiosity has a need to be discovered. Let's go. I think you could be a little more visceral here or focus a little more on the sensory details. So she feels that these lights or these insects are calling to her. Is that sort of like a psychological feeling or like a psychic feeling? Or is it more tangible? Does she think the way they're moving is taunting her? I'm just not exactly sure what she's experiencing that's making her feel like they are calling to her. It's something that I think you could work on across the scene, is just pulling the reader a little bit more into Victoria's shoes. It's just sometimes not clear exactly what she's feeling or what she's experiencing, and additional sensory details would really help with that. I also, again, feel that the dialogue with the horse is maybe a little immature, or it's coming across, or it's making her come across as younger. Again, you could also just pair this with more mature introspection and it would sort of balance out. But right now, I think you're maybe relying on this dialogue with the horse a little bit too much rather than fleshing out what her internal thoughts and feelings are like. Victoria nudged Novi deeper into the woods. Novi grunted and snorted as they walked. He shook his head in protest, but continued to let Victoria guide him. Because I've read the whole scene already, I'm thinking that this paragraph is meant to demonstrate that the horse detects something odd about these blue lights. If that's the case, then I would emphasize that concept by adding something like, it was so unlike him. Victoria was the one afraid of the dark, not Novi. That will clue the reader in that something is off with the horse's behavior. Otherwise, this paragraph just seems like unnecessary descriptions. Maybe we can get on the other side of them, Victoria said. If they could get on the other side of them, she felt like she had a better chance of catching one. We can push them back toward the house. Victoria pulled Novi back toward the path. She could go faster on the path and push the insects towards the house. There is a lot of redundancy in the last few sentences. Trying to get on the other side of the insects and trying to push the insects towards the house are each explained in both the dialogue and narration. I would tighten this up. Make sure you're only explaining each concept once, unless there's a very good reason to reiterate it. Maybe she really had no idea what she was doing. No wonder her father preferred studying stationary plant life. Catching a bug proved to be more difficult than she expected, and she'd barely begun. This is some nice natural sounding introspection. This type of introspection to explain her thoughts and reasoning throughout the scene would be really helpful. But this specific introspection maybe doesn't feel as logical as it could, just because as a reader, it doesn't really feel like she's done a whole lot at this point to attempt to catch the insect. So her mentioning finding it so difficult that plants would be easier to study feels maybe a hair dramatic or defeatist, but maybe that fits with your character. I'm not sure because I don't know all that much about your novel. I think this also kind of cuts out the sense of momentum because it's placed in a little bit of a more action-oriented moment when we should be really focused on her attempt to catch the bug. So I would probably move this introspection if you really think that it's necessary. I'm not sure if it really fits right here because it doesn't feel like she's really done a whole lot just yet. Once they emerged onto the path, Victoria kicked Novi into a trot. It was too dangerous to gallop even on the path because of all the low branches that spread above it. At a trot, she was able to duck out of the way. I would probably add a little bit more of Victoria's intention into this wording. For example, she wanted to go faster, to get to the bugs before they flew away, but a gallop would be too dangerous. This would just glue the concepts together a bit more and create a bigger sense of drive because the moment feels a little low energy considering she's face to face with her goal. A sort of consistent area to work on is bringing across Victoria's mental or emotional state more clearly to the reader. So at this point in the scene, I think it would be really helpful to add a little more introspection about why this insect is so important to Victoria. So I understand that she's never seen it before, but why does that matter? I mean, it's probable that you explain this at least partly in chapter one, which I don't have, so I don't know what information the reader would already have. I don't know if she collects bugs. I don't know if she just wants to make a discovery. But in any case, even if you explain this in the first chapter, I think this would be a good point in the scene to add a reminder to sort of help the reader understand, why does she want to catch this bug? Why is it so important? What will she gain by doing so? I would also try to connect it to her party a little bit more. Why is getting this bug today so important that she would go out on the morning of her birthday and presumably risk getting in trouble or risk being late to her party? I'm just not clear on why the bug needs to be shown off at the party, why she needs to go out today to get the bug. It just feels that the circumstances aren't coming across entirely clearly. And again, it could have been made clear in chapter one, but I still think some introspection about that, about the scenario surrounding why she wants to do this, would help to get the reader more invested in the scene.
She could see the lights in the woods to her right. They floated through the trees at a leisurely pace, as though they had no goal or destination. Once she and Novi were far enough in front of the bugs, she cut back into the woods with some difficulty and slowed Novi back to a walk in the thick underbrush. Victoria marched the horse towards the lights, hoping to corral them back towards the path where she could get down and catch one in her jar. This last sentence feels redundant because this is already clear from the previous paragraph.
Since the bugs are described as moving so slowly, I think it would really help the logical progression of the scene if she attempts to just go up and catch one and then they sort of move or scatter or rush away or whatever. Right now, it feels a little odd that she wants to try to drive the bugs towards the house, or that she's formulating this whole plan when they're described as moving at a leisurely pace. It seems like, for logic's sake, that she would first try to just approach them and catch one.
In her determination, Victoria hadn't noticed how deep into the woods she'd gone. It was darker now, despite the full morning sun. The trees closed around them, and Victoria couldn't see the house at all. Her father would be furious if he knew. I would probably cut this last sentence about her father being furious, because the previous sentences, the trees closing around them, it being dark, support fear of the woods being her primary concern. While piling on concerns can sometimes work well to increase tension, I think fear of the woods would overshadow her fear of her father, unless he's a particularly scary guy, which is possible, but you've given the impression he isn't actually a threat. The swarm seemed to notice her and flew in front of her at a steady rate. The wording to me here implies that they are keeping the same distance in front of her purposefully for some reason. Maybe they're sort of taunting her, rather than that they're trying to get away. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting your intention correctly, so this is possibly confusing, or maybe I'm just confused and it makes sense to other people, but I think it might be worth clarifying this. They stepped out onto the path again, but Victoria still couldn't see the house. It's a little unclear if she's stepping onto the path as part of her plan or because she's scared and is hoping to be able to see the house, so I would reword for clarity. She held out the jar and nudged Novi into a trot to catch up to the swarm.
Since Victoria is a teenager, it would be nice to have a better sense for why she is so afraid of not being able to see the house. So fear is totally reasonable. I mean, even irrational fears in adults, it's completely reasonable for a character. I'm just not sure if this is being presented as irrational. It seems like it's just sort of being presented as just a basic fear. There isn't more context for understanding it. So if this is a personal fear of hers, I would sort of emphasize that, maybe even allude to how she got this fear, or sort of imply maybe that she's just more fearful in general. But I'm just not getting a sense of why this is so risky for her. So the path leads from her house through the woods. Walking on a path isn't usually an activity that we would discourage even fairly young children from doing, because you can just walk back down the path to the house. So it's a little confusing to me why the house not being visible would matter when the path just leads back to the house. So there isn't really an opportunity for her to get lost while on the path. I'm not sure if she's just not allowed to be out of the view of the house. I kind of get that impression. Again, I'm not really sure why she wouldn't be allowed out of the view of the house if she is an older teen. It just doesn't seem like the risk is there. Maybe there is something really risky about these woods, in which case I would definitely imply that or include that in the introspection. Whatever the case, I just think the introspection or the narration, it needs to be clearer why she's afraid of the woods. Again, it could just be irrational and that's completely fine, but also why she's so concerned about not being able to see the house when the path goes to the house. I just feel that this needs to be clarified a little bit. It's just not completely obvious why this is such a big concern for her, and a lot of it's brought up frequently. It's returned to often, and I just don't think it's clear why. It is possible that the problem here is that you're attempting to create an internal conflict for a scene that you didn't really plan an internal conflict for. So it's possible this doesn't make sense. It's also possible it makes sense, and I just don't know why it makes sense because you know your story and your character better than I do. So you'll have to make a determination there.
They were so close she could almost scoop one into the jar. She leaned on the horse, holding the reins tight in her other hand. The insects were so close, only about a foot away from her outstretched hand. Two sentences ending in hand reads a little clunky, so I would probably reword one of them. She leaned farther, slipping in the saddle just a tiny bit. She urged Novi faster, but he wouldn't speed up. Why won't he speed up here? Is he scared? Is he obstinate? Is he just an old horse? Victoria could probably reflect on this a little bit or react to it a little bit just to help the reader be on the same page as her. Victoria leaned back into the seat, dropping her hand to her lap. She scooted up, twisted her hand with the reins into Novi's hair, leaned forward and stretched out her jar and kicked the horse into a gallop. The last sentence feels a little redundant because it's almost the exact same description as the first part of the paragraph, holding tight to the reins, stretching out the jar, and encouraging Novi to go faster. Overall, there's a little bit too much of a play-by-play feel to this action sequence. You could cut it down or you could break it up with introspection. You could also work to gradually increase intensity so that when essentially the same thing happens multiple times, it feels increasingly more intense. You might even want to directly draw attention to the differences compared to the previous similar event. For example, you could change the last sentence to something like, she scooted up again, this time twisting her hand into Novi's hair for a stronger grip. Just letting the reader know that things are escalating can be helpful. Victoria swiped the jar at the swarm and almost had one when the bugs changed directions and came at them in a cluster. Novi reared up and whinnied, and Victoria dropped her jar. I think you could add more sensation to this moment. When the swarm changes directions, do they smack Victoria in the face? If so, are they tickly like flies? Are they heavy, more like cicadas? Are their wings loud? Just giving some sensory details can really help the reader feel like they're experiencing this moment alongside Victoria. She grabbed the reins in both hands. Novi crashed back down and then began backing down the path as the lights flickered and flashed toward him. Is there something threatening about these bugs to Victoria? If so, that can help to clarify the horse's reaction. If not, so Victoria doesn't see these bugs as particularly threatening, then I would add introspection or dialogue from Victoria in which she says something about not understanding the horse's reaction. This will help keep the reader's thoughts in alignment with Victoria's, because right now it's just not clear if she thinks the horse is scared, if she thinks that's valid or not, if she also feels afraid. It would just be helpful to sort of get the reader and Victoria on the same page with what's going on. Also, the sentence structure feels quite repetitive in this paragraph. Victoria swiped, Novi reared, Victoria dropped, she grabbed, Novi crashed. The repetitive structure gives this happened, then this happened, then this happened feel, which really zaps away a lot of the energy in the scene. Adding more sensory details and some introspection here and there will probably solve this problem on its own just by breaking those sentences up so that it's less of the same sentence structure over and over. Novi, Victoria shouted, but the horse was beyond calming down. He reared again and Victoria slipped in her saddle. Her hands shot out for extra hold on his mane, and when Novi pounded the earth with his hooves, Victoria slipped farther from her saddle. She had both arms around his neck now and began to panic. She needed to get him steady so she could get a better grip. Rather than she had both arms around his neck now, I would make this more active, something like she flung her arms around his neck. I also think her panicking could be shown by her actions and or introspection rather than just being told. I think you're over describing the action here and would get a better reaction from the reader if you tightened it up a little. I would probably cut one of the times she slips from the saddle, but alternatively, you could break them up with dialogue, introspection, sensory details, whatever you want. Just pay attention to sort of guiding the reader through increasing and decreasing tension. There's a lot of the same type of things happening: grabbing the reins, grabbing Novi's hair, slipping in the saddle. And without explaining why one instance is better or worse, so the circumstances are better or worse than the previous circumstance, it kind of just blurs together, almost like stage direction. It lacks interpretation to get the reader excited and to help the reader sort of follow the flow of the scene. Novi reared again and pawed his hooves in the air. He was batting at the blue glowing swarm. This could be combined into one sentence: Novi reared again and batted at the blue glowing swarm, just to tighten things up a little bit. When he crashed back down, Victoria jostled in her seat but didn't lose her grip. You might consider cutting when, just because it makes the action feel less immediate. Novi leapt into a sprint down the path leading out of the woods. Something like back towards their house might be clearer to the reader than leading out of the woods. Victoria screamed as Novi bucked down the path, kicking his front and hind legs as the swarm dashed in figure eights around his legs. I would try to reword to avoid repeating legs. She grabbed the reins and wrapped them around her hands, pulling hard to get Novi back under her control. The mass of light swirled up in front of the horse and then swooped behind him. Novi kicked and bucked, whickering loudly. Victoria screamed again as she slipped to one side. The first half and second half of this paragraph are almost exactly the same. Novi bucks, the light swarm or swirl, and Victoria screams. Like with previous paragraphs that had a similar problem, I would just try to make a clearer distinction between what's happening in the first and second half by trying to sort of increase intensity. You might also consider just cutting out some of the action to avoid so much repetition. She wrapped her fingers in Novi's mane again and pulled herself upright. The blue swarm disappeared into the woods behind them, and Victoria leaned forward in the saddle. She kicked Novi into a gallop, taking deep breaths. I'm not sure if Victoria is feeling relief here. Does she think the threat is over? A little introspection would help keep the reader in her shoes. They rushed down the path, and Victoria saw her father running down the steps of the porch. He was shouting to her, but she couldn't hear him over Novi's hooves beating against the earth and her heart beating in her ears. We could make this a little more immersive by cutting out the filtering Victoria saw, although in this case, because you're describing something that previously wasn't visible but now is visible, I think it would be helpful to write something like, they were nearly out of the woods and Victoria could see the house now. I would also consider a more immersive description of her father shouting, but her not being able to hear it. Maybe something like, his mouth was open in a scream, but all she could hear was the thumping of Novi's hooves. I really want you to try to put the reader into Victoria's shoes just a little bit more. As they reached the edge of the woods, the mass of blue lights appeared in front of Novi. It twisted between Novi's legs and rushed upward in front of him. The horse snorted and squealed. He jerked up onto his hind legs, kicking his forelegs at the lights and sending Victoria careening off his back into a tree. Everything went black. So how I was imagining these woods, the trail, the house, and the speed of the horse, from my imagination, the time between the horse being visible to her father on the porch and the horse being out of the woods entirely would be like just seconds, since the horse is going so fast. But maybe the trail's very straight or the woods are very sparse. This might just be a me thing, so maybe get some other opinions on if the timing of this feels off. It just seems to me like too much time has passed between the horse becoming visible and to have the horse still be in the woods.
Because of the lack of introspection and because the intensity doesn't really increase across the different moments of action, it doesn't feel like there was this big buildup to Victoria getting thrown off the horse. It more feels like she just happened to not get thrown off the horse all the other times, and then this time she just happened to get thrown off. And I don't think that's actually the case. I just think that's what sort of comes across because there isn't that sense of building and increasing intensity.
So to summarize my main recommendations for this chapter, determine if the first scene where Victoria leaves a letter for her father is necessary. If so, clarify the conflict. Consider cutting or aging up the dialogue between Victoria and the horse. When similar actions are repeated, convey an increase or decrease in tension. Include more sensory details to better ground the reader in Victoria's experience. Use more introspection throughout to clarify Victoria's reasoning for her actions. Clarify the following. Why Victoria wants to catch this insect. What will she gain by doing so? What will she lose if she fails? Why Victoria leaves when it's still dark. Are the bugs only out in the morning? Will her father punish her if he catches her? Why Victoria is so concerned with seeing the house. Is this a rule? Is she just afraid of the dark? Are the woods inherently dangerous?
I'm really, really, really grateful that she let us look at this scene because I think it does a good job of demonstrating a lot of sort of common problems that you might run into. In particular, she shared with me that she feels this scene is maybe not as interesting as it could be. So it's a necessary scene. It's obligatory for the manuscript. It cannot be taken out. But it's maybe a little boring or not as interesting or as exciting as she would like it to be. And I think a lot of writers will have experienced a similar type of scene or a problematic scene of this nature where you have to include it, but it's just not really shining as bright as it could. So thank you so much again to Cabrielle Holden for letting us look at her second chapter. I really, really, really appreciate it. If you want to further support Cabrielle, you can follow her on Instagram at Cabrielle Holden, or you can go to her website, cabrielleholden.com. And again, constructive criticism is more than welcome in the comments, but please be kind and appreciative of Cabrielle for letting us look at her second chapter. It's definitely difficult to put yourself out there and to put your work out there. If you want me to do an editing demonstration on your novel, you can submit it to me on Patreon. I will be putting up a form that you'll need to fill out to do that. If you guys want to see more episodes of this, just let me know how you're feeling, how you like the format, if there's anything I could do to make it more educational, more understandable, or if you love the format, that is great too. Just please let me know. And also, I would appreciate if you would share this video with your writing friends or your writing groups or anything like that, just so that we can get a little bit more views. It would really, really help me out. And if you would like some private critiques, we do have a critique channel on the Patreon Discord where you guys can critique each other's work. If you don't want it to be public, you can post on there and we'd be happy to have you. And I will be back with another video. I believe that I will be talking about freelance editing, hiring a freelance editor, primarily whether you should hire a freelance editor. I believe that is what I will be talking about in the next video. So if you want to see that, go ahead and subscribe if you're not subscribed. Otherwise, I will see you guys soon. And in the meantime, happy writing.